Welcome to the very first episode of Matt Talks Media. I'm Matt, and this is where I dig into the underground music, indie horror, alternative art, and the research that connects all of these things together. Since this is episode one, I wanted to start by giving you a better idea of who I am and why I'm doing this. I figured an introduction needs to happen in episode one. That way, we don't get to episode 20 and you still don't know anything about this guy. So, I'm an Oklahoma native. I was born in Tulsa, but now I'm living out in Weatherford. That's about an hour west of the Oklahoma City metro. So, it's pretty rural, pretty small, but good community vibes, and I really enjoy it out here. I've bounced around quite a bit though over the years. So I spent 6 years in Denver, 3 years up in Northwest Ohio, and 1 year in North Carolina. So I've lived all over the place. All of those moves shaped how I experienced music and media, mainly because every place has a different scene, a different vibe, and so on and so on. Academically, though, I started out with my bachelor's in multimedia journalism and my master's in communication studies from Northeastern State University. So that's out in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, which is out northeast. Really fun place to go visit. They have a really fun pizza restaurant called Sam and Ella's. If you say it quickly, it's like salmonella, and I think that's kind of funny. I went on to earn my PhD in media audiences and processes, which is basically a fancy way of saying media effects from Bowling Green State University, and that's when I was in Northwest Ohio. After that, I spent a year teaching as an assistant professor of communication at St. Andrews University in Laurinburg, North Carolina. I was only there for a year, and then I decided it was time to come back home and be an Okie. So right now, I'm in my second year as an assistant professor of communication and director of public speaking here at Southwestern Oklahoma State University. But before all of that, there's a music side of me. I've been playing the bass guitar since I was probably 14 years old. My first real band was a two-piece death metal group I started in high school with my best friend at the time. That was called Sledgehammer Autopsy. Now, if that doesn't paint a good picture in your head, I don't know what will. So later on, when I moved back to Oklahoma, I joined this thrash metal band, and I say joined, I helped found it. This thrash metal band called Death Inquisition with a guy I met through the metal archives on the forum, and then another guy that I met at a concert who's still to this day one of my best friends. From there, I branched out. I played bass in my first black metal band called The Great He Goat, and we managed to release a full-length album. So that was kind of like a musical milestone for me. In 2014 or around that time, I tried my hand out as a vocalist. This was the first time I had ever done vocals in a band, and I formed a sludge metal influenced band called Lung Butter, kind of like, the stuff that you cough up in the wintertime when you're getting sick. Uh, it was kind of a joke name for a band, but it turned out to be pretty fun. We like to call ourselves junkyard metal. So my last full-time music project was the most successful one. We were called Abyssal Rights. We were formed in 2018. Again, I was the vocalist. I kept doing the vocal thing and kind of put bass playing to the wayside. So we played black metal with a lot of hardcore influences. So if you want to hear a band that sounds like in the vein of Abyssal Rights, maybe think about bands like Young and In the Way or maybe Carpathian Forest. So we released a demo, an EP, and several singles, and we played a lot of out-of-town shows. That's kind of what we were known for. We didn't play locally very often. So for example, we played a music festival in Sturgis, South Dakota, where they do the whole motorcycle rally thing. So that was a lot of fun. In between all of those things, though, I had a bunch of one-off solo projects with names like Swamp Goat, Canvas, Napalm Unit, and lastly, Jimmy Hoffa and the Lords of Destruction. So I'm going to explain that last one just a little bit because it's the most interesting thing I've ever done musically. So at band practice, sometimes we would, at the end of the practice, we would try something fun and we would all switch instruments and just play. So at the time, I was a bass guitarist, so I would switch to vocals. Our guitarist would switch to bass. Our vocalist at the time would switch to guitar, and then when we would usually just keep the drummer because he was the only one that could actually play drums. And then we would just make random noisy music, mostly like grindcore and stuff like that. We ended up out of, just wanting to have fun. We booked a show as Jimmy Hoffa and the Lords of Destruction, and we played at a house venue in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, called I think it was Rudy's Place or Rudy's House, one of the two. Maybe some local people who are listening to this can will remember that place. So we booked a show there, and we opened up for some random touring like hardcore band, and everybody absolutely hated it. Most people walked out when I said, we're Jimmy Hoffa and the Lords of Destruction, and we play freeform grindcore. There was like an audible groan. People walked out. Those who stayed were probably confused, maybe angry, who knows. But it was a ton of fun, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. So if my Jimmy Hoffa friends are listening, let's go book a show and just mess up people's night. So why am I sharing all of this? Because themes of this podcast, such as underground music, indie art, alternative media, these things are not just abstract ideas to me. They've been my lived experience. I've been on the stage. I've been in rehearsal spaces. I've been in the blog trenches trying to write. I've written reviews for a couple of different websites, like my own blog and the Metal Archives. I've been, documenting the underground. So that's why I want to talk about all of this stuff. With that being said, let's dive into a music break, shall we? So my goal is to showcase bands that I find on Bandcamp. If people submit music to me, I really want to showcase underground music because this platform is all about that. This first band is called Arid. That's ARID. They describe themselves as a misanthropic crust punk / death metal three-piece from Chicago, Illinois. This first track from them is called Hell's Wheel. Enjoy. right, welcome back. I hope you guys enjoyed that track. Again, that was Arid with the song Hell's Wheel. So let's start with the big question. What is alternative media? You heard me mention alternative media a bunch of times in the introduction. You might be saying to yourself, what is that? What does Dr. Dorr mean when he says that? At its simplest, alternative media means media created outside of the mainstream, outside of corporate or government controlled systems. But that definition is really just a starting point. So scholars like Chris Atten argue that alternative media isn't just about who makes it, it's about the practices behind making the media. Alternative media is usually small scale, it's usually non-commercial, participatory, and community focused. So think about the difference between the Rolling Stone versus reading a punk zine your friend photocopied at Kinko's. There's a big difference between those two things, right? Not only visually, but how it's made. One has glossy ads for guitars and festivals. The other has cut and paste layout, smudged ink, a personal rant about how the local venue ripped off some hardcore band. That zine isn't trying to compete with the Rolling Stone on money or reach, because that would be impossible. It's trying to tell its own story in its own way. And that's where things really get interesting, right? Alternative media can look very different depending on the context. It could be something like a pirate radio broadcast back in the 80s. So somebody buys, a ham radio and broadcasts whatever they want outside of, FCC regulations. It could be a blog in the 2000s or a blog today. Those also look very different with the, evolution of the internet. It could even be a Discord server today if you want to really get into apps and what information communication technology is doing. What unites them isn't really the format, but it's the intent to create spaces for voices, communities, and ideas that mainstream either ignores or rejects or misappropriates. So Leah Libro, she wrote a really cool book about alternative media and genre, takes this further by saying alternative media comes in genres. So she identified 5 of those, and I won't go into full detail now about what these genres mean, but just know that before this book came out, we really didn't have a way to categorize types of alternative media. So the 5 that she came up with were culture jamming, such as taking a corporate ad and graffitiing it or changing it in a way to change the meaning, alternative computing or ethical hacking, participatory journalism, which is what we're really dealing with, mediated mobilization or getting activists involved and moving, and commons knowledge. That's where you have things like Wikipedia, where people come together to build something like a database. So we're going to come back to those, but the point is that alternative media is flexible. It's a toolbox. It changes with technology. So what we could do in 1998 is completely different than what we can do now in terms of technology. But that core idea is the same. Tell your own story on your own terms. So before we move on to the next segment, we're going to do another little musical break. I try to put in these musical breaks in between each major segment. That way you're not just listening to me talk for, 45 minutes straight. So this time we're playing a classic in terms of old school punk music. Let's listen to Crass. Do They Owe Us a Living from 1978.
No, that I rub anymore, roll up blow. Used to call me sweet thing, all I put is blind thing. Now that I'm different, you love the best way. You love to see me come out, love to see me dead. Do they owe us a living? Cause I do, owe us a living. Cause I do, owe us a living. Cause I fucking do. Living that is up to me, I'm never gonna get. I got this so roll up until it's in there. Give it a bar me, something like that. I got a bear me. For the smoke, do they owe fucking new. Don't take any notice what the public think. Someone said it's TV, just the worst thing. You try to target, leave out to the voice. You don't wanna wear it, so you're full of vice. Do they owe us a living? Cause they do, owe us a living. Cause they do, owe us a living. Cause they fucking do.
Once again, that was Crass. Do They Owe Us a Living from all the way back in 1978. So let's talk about activism and non-activism. So what does that mean? So when most scholars talk about alternative media, they focus on activist media. So the media that comes out of social movements. So think about Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the civil rights movement, climate movements. So the media that comes out of those movements is that activist media that a lot of alternative media scholars look at. A lot of famous examples come from activism. But think about things like feminist zines like Spare Rib in the UK or the Riot Girl zines in the 1990s. Those weren't just about music, they were manifestos about sexism, politics, and identity. So there's a lot more there than just music. But music is also a key element in those magazines. Or think about community radio stations organized around environmental or labor rights issues. Those outlets had a clear mission to push for social and political change. But here's the thing, not all alternative media is activist. In my research, I focused on what I call non-activist alternative media. These are blogs, forums, or projects that aren't directly political, but they're still important because they document things like culture, create identity, and connect people. So take Angry Metal Guy, for example, or my own blog, Murdered Culture. We weren't trying to start a protest movement. We were just trying to write about underground music, things like demo tapes, unsigned bands, obscure genres. But that work still mattered. It preserved a record of a scene that might not otherwise appear, or it might disappear if nobody's, recording these things. It gave fans a place to gather and argue about what was good, what was overrated, and what deserved attention, mainly because blogs afford the ability to have comment sections, right? So one person I interviewed for my dissertation put it very bluntly. They said, "We're not journalists, we're fans, we're enthusiasts. That's the point." And it captures that heart of non-activist alternative media. It's not about activism in the political sense, but it's still activism in a cultural sense, fighting for a band, a scene, or a genre that might otherwise be forgotten. Speaking of bands and genres sticking around, it's time for some more music. This time we're going to listen to a grindcore band called Organ Shredder with their completely serious grindcore. No jokes. This one's called Porcupines Coming to Eat Your Face.
The slow but sure-footed porcupine is world-renowned for one thing, its quills. Once driven into flesh, a quill will continue to work deeper and will eventually work its way right through, if not quickly removed.
If you heard before, the porcupines are coming to eat your face.
All right, welcome back. So that was Organ Shredder with the track Porcupines Coming to Eat Your Face. That sounds absolutely horrifying, and I hope that never happens to me or anybody I know. So let's talk about the historical roots of alternative media. So you're probably wondering, how old is alternative media? It's not a term that I'm familiar with. Well, alternative media isn't new. It's been around as long as the mainstream media itself. So let's start in the 19th century. Working class and labor newspapers are there to give voices to people excluded from elite presses. So those who couldn't afford the higher end, journals and the daily news. They weren't glossy publications; they're practical publications. They are political and they're made by communities for themselves. In the 1960s, you had things like the underground press explode. You had papers covering the counterculture, anti war, protest, and civil rights. So there's publications like the Berkeley Barb out of UC Berkeley and the East Village Other. So these papers, they're not professional in the corporate sense, but they were essential to those movements. By the 1980s, no, I almost said 1880s, punk isn't that old. But from the 1980s and 90s, zine culture becomes a huge thing, especially in the punk culture. So punk and hardcore kids, they armed themselves with things like scissors, glue, and a Xerox machine, and they could suddenly produce magazines filled with reviews, rants, interviews, political manifestos. So one example of this is Maximum Rock and Roll, and that's all one word if you want to look it up. They were one of the most famous, but there were thousands of local zines, each tied to its own scene. For example, the Riot Girl zines were particularly legendary for giving young women a space to express their voice in a male dominated punk culture. In the late 1990s and into the 2000s, you see the internet become a thing. It became the new photocopier. Blogs and forums carried on the zine tradition. Zines still exist, obviously, but nowadays it's much easier to form a blog or a website to get a global audience. So websites like the Metal Archives became a massive fan-run encyclopedia. Angry Metal Guy and Natskog's blog become digital zines. And those are both digital forums, online interactive websites, whatever you want to call them. Those are two that I researched in my dissertation. And I encourage you to look them up. The content is rather good. So each era had its own tools, but the motivation was the same. Tell the stories that the mainstream won't. So I think having a little bit of historical context is important, right? So this isn't some newfangled thing. It's been around essentially since the dawn of American history, really. Once we had the printing press, more people became literate, more people had a story to tell, and some of that we consider alternative, whether it's not being represented well in the mainstream, not being represented the right way, for whatever motivation. So earlier I mentioned genre, right? So how do we classify genres of alternative media? I want to break down those 5 genres that I mentioned earlier by Livro and kind of explain them in a little bit more depth because it ties into underground music and culture. So that first one is culture jamming. This is about subverting mainstream media. So a famous example of this is Adbusters, which created fake ads mocking consumer culture. So in music, you see this in satirical reviews, parody bands, or album art that spoofs big brands. Think of punk flyers that reuse corporate logos but twist them around to change the meaning. Alternative computing is also an interesting one. So you have hackers, coders, or DIY technologists building new tools. For underground musicians, this might be using cracked software to record demos, running DIY websites, or building forums from scratch. So these tools themselves become part of the alternative ethos. Next, you have participatory journalism. So this is where fans become reporters. Blogs like Angry Metal Guy or Natskog's blog, people writing on the Metal Archives, my own blog, Murdered Culture, which is defunct now, but it's still a good example, where ordinary fans are writing reviews, conducting interviews, and publishing their takes. Usually not for money, but for the love of the scene. You have mediated mobilization, which is another genre. So it's using media to organize. So punk zines in the 1980s would publish tour dates, address lists for tape trading, letters to connect scenes across cities. Now we have online blogs and forums to keep that alive. Promoting shows, sharing Bandcamp links, encouraging people to support DIY labels. Those are all still going on today. And then lastly, we have commons knowledge. So, commons knowledge is where information is gathered and shared collectively. So, websites like the Metal Archives is the best example of this. Thousands of fans contribute information. They write reviews. They add to band histories to build a giant database. It's not owned by a corporation. It's owned by the commons. It's maintained by the community. So these genres show that alternative media isn't just one thing. It's its own ecosystem, and underground music has touched every part of that ecosystem. Now, I think that's enough of me talking for just a moment. Let's get into another music break. So staying on that grindcore oriented frame of mind, we're going to check out a band called Deliriant Nerve. This track is called Face the Knife. That was Deliriant Nerve with the track Face the Knife, and I hope you enjoyed it. So I want to ground all of this in some personal stories because for me, alternative media has never been something I only read about in books. It's something that I lived. So I want to start with the Metal Archives. That site has been a huge part of my life since I first discovered it. If you've never been there, it's basically a fan-driven encyclopedia of metal. Anyone can contribute band information, reviews, or links. For me, it was a gateway. I spent hours clicking the random band button and stumbling across projects from all over the world. Whether it was a 1-minute bedroom black metal band from Russia or the forgotten thrash band from Brazil. Suddenly, the underground wasn't just local, it was a global thing for me, and I could explore it with a single click of a button. It just wasn't about discovery though, so the Metal Archives gave me a voice. I started writing reviews there under my username, which was Overkill666. I know that's super edgy, but I was a teenager at the time. What can you do? And it was my first taste of what it meant to put your opinion out there into the world for others to read. Those reviews didn't just disappear, they stayed up. People commented on them, people argued against them or for them, and people used them to decide what music to check out. That was my first real experience with alternative media as a persistence, as a kind of archive. Then came Murdered Culture, which was my own personal blog. That's where I started to really develop my style and my voice as a writer. So I reviewed albums that no mainstream magazine was ever going to touch with a 10-foot pole. Raw black metal demos, one-man projects, bands that maybe had 50 listeners worldwide. One of my favorite memories was getting an email from a band after I reviewed their tiny little demo. They thanked me for taking the time. To them, my little write-up meant visibility. It meant somebody cared. That's the power of alternative media right there. It creates connections that the mainstream channels ignore. I also use Murdered Culture to interview bands and share conversations about their process, their philosophy, their place in the underground scene. It wasn't just reviews for me. It was about documenting a scene that deserved to be remembered. And honestly, those projects, like the Metal Archives and Murdered Culture, they weren't just hobbies. They helped me build relationships. So, for example, the band Death Inquisition came together because of the metal archives and because I met somebody at a concert. Later on, those relationships evolved into bands like the Great He Goat and Abyssal Rights. Without those online spaces, those connections might never have happened. So, when I talk about alternative media, I'm not just talking about an abstract theory, I'm talking about real lived experiences. Writing reviews at 2 a.m., checking stats on a blog post, waiting nervously to see if anybody's responded, and then realizing somebody across the world read what I wrote. And that's the underground in action, and that's why I care about it so damn much. So, why does alternative media matter? I just mentioned that I care about it so damn much, so why does it matter? Well, hopefully, this convinces you. So, why should we care about alternative media? First, because it documents culture that might otherwise disappear. So, without things like zines, we'd have a much harder time reconstructing the history of punk and hardcore, for example. Without blogs, entire corners of the underground black metal scene might go unrecorded. Alternative media is often the only written record of these communities. Second, it builds community. A zine from the 80s might have connected hardcore kids from different states. A blog today can connect fans from across the globe. These spaces give fans and musicians a shared place to argue, celebrate, and connect. Third, it shapes identity. Reading a zine or contributing to a blog tells you that you belong to something bigger than yourself. It's not just media, it's a cultural signal. This is who we are. One of my dissertation participants summed this up beautifully. They said, if we don't write about this, nobody else will. That's the heart of it. Alternative media matters because it ensures that underground culture doesn't just flicker out after a show or a tape swap. It gets remembered, archived, and then passed on. And that matters not just for fans, but for history and for people like me who do research in this realm. So we're going to take our last music break and we're going to check out the band Mass 49 with their track Visual Poisoning. As a reminder, you can find all of the music in this episode of the podcast on Bandcamp. So please support the artist. Give them some bucks. Again, this is Mass 49 with Visual Poisoning. All right, welcome back from the break. That was Mass 49 with Visual Poisoning. Hope you dug it. So the last thing I'm going to do is give you just a recommended reading list. If anything I've said has really gotten you interested, you want to learn more, you want to go deeper than how I'm talking about it here, these are some books that could help you understand that a little bit better. So let's start with Atten from 2002, Alternative Media. There's Atten and Hamilton from 2008 called Alternative Journalism. Downing from 2001, Radical Media, Rebellious Communication and Social Movements. There's Duncombe from 1997, Notes from the Underground, Zines and the Politics of Alternative Culture. Marcus from 2010, Girls to the Front, The True Story of the Riot Girl Revolution. And then lastly, Livro from 2015, Alternative and Activist New Media. So any of those books are great. dive into them. If you have questions about them, please drop a comment, send me an email, and we can talk about them further. So that's our first deep dive into alternative media. We've looked at definitions, history, activist and non-activist forms, genres, and some personal stories of how I've engaged with alternative media in my life. In future episodes, we're going to keep building on these ideas. We're going to look at DIY recording, horror soundtracks, indie aesthetics, the affordances that shape how communities use technology. I'm going to have all sorts of bonus episodes as well. Maybe I want to look at alternative spaces for cryptids. That's something I'm considering. So there's going to be so many ways to talk about alternative media because it's ever evolving and it's still forming to this day, right? So every new blog that pops up, has that chance of being something that I could look at. Thanks for joining me on this first episode of Matt Talks Media. If you like what you heard, subscribe, share it with a friend, and keep listening as we explore the underground together.